All right, so have you seen these news stories lately? The ones that sound like, I don't know, something out of a spy movie.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
We've got one of those for you today.
Buckle up.
It's got Ukraine, a whole mountain of minerals, and even a visit from Zelenskyy to the White House.
It's a story that's, well, a lot more interesting than the headlines let on, I'd say.
Yeah, it's not just about some rocks and riches.
Right, we're talking about, like, potential shifts in power, economic futures and, all that whole dance of international relations.
And all this started with what would you call it? A controversial proposal.
Yeah, controversial might be putting it lightly, actually. The first draft, the one from the Trump administration, well, let's just say it got some serious pushback.
Really?
Yeah, not only from Ukraine, but European allies, too.
So let's dive into this. We're looking at this Financial Times article. It paints a really interesting picture of what's at stake here. What was it about this first proposal that caused all this commotion?
Okay, so imagine this. You're smack dab in the middle of a war, right? Fighting for your survival. And then someone asks you to pay back aid with resources you haven't even gotten to yet.
Oof.
Yeah, that was basically the first proposal in a nutshell.
That's a tough sell for sure.
No kidding. And Zelenskyy, well, he wasn't exactly thrilled. It even caused some friction between him and President Trump, publicly even, which really complicated things.
Yikes. That doesn't sound like the smoothest start to negotiations.
Not at all.
But they did eventually come to an agreement, right?
Yeah, they did. They hammered out a revised agreement, and it all hinges on a fund. Ukraine puts in 50% of what they make from their minerals into this fund, and the U.S. is a partner.
Wait, 50%? That's a huge chunk of their potential earnings.
Absolutely. For our listeners, think of it like this. It's like splitting all the profits from a Tesla gigafactory right down the middle.
Wow, okay, so what kind of minerals are we talking about here?
We're talking about the essentials. Lithium, cobalt, graphite, the stuff that makes our world tick. Think electric car batteries, smartphones, all that.
So Ukraine's sitting on a gold mine.
Yeah.
Literally.
You could say that, yeah. And the U.S., well, they definitely see the value in getting a piece of that.
But here's the thing, and it's a big thing. This agreement, it doesn't actually have any solid promises about security from the U.S., does it?
That's the catch, yeah. And it's why people are raising eyebrows. You've got Ukraine in a really vulnerable spot, basically betting on future wealth for some stability right now.
So it's a gamble, a big one, with no guarantee of a win.
Exactly. And that's where you see the worry from European leaders coming in. People like Macron and Starmer, they've been pretty vocal about this, stressing that any agreement has to put Ukraine's security first. They're even talking about maybe needing troops on the ground and offering heavy support.
Wow. So not just economic help, but actual boots on the ground.
Yeah, that's what's being suggested. It really shows how worried Europe is about how unstable things are.
And what about Zelenskyy? Where does he stand in all of this?
Well, remember those initial terms, the ones that caused all that friction? Word on the street is Zelenskyy was pretty unhappy with that first draft. It was asking a lot from Ukraine without giving much back. This final version seems to be easier to swallow, but all those details about what the U.S. will actually do, those are still being worked out. This whole thing with Ukraine, it kind of reminds me of a pattern we've seen before.
Oh, really? What do you mean?
Well, think about those countries in the Middle East with all the oil.
Okay, yeah.
They've got resources the world needs, but they're in, well, let's just say it's not the most peaceful neighborhood.
Right, so their valuable resources are kind of a blessing and a curse. Gives them power, but also makes them a target.
Exactly, and that leads to some, well, complicated relationships with the big global players. Everyone wants those resources, but it's a whole web of rivalries,
So you're saying Zelenskyy is kind of in a similar spot. He needs to use Ukraine's minerals to boost their economy, but also keep the country safe in a tough region.
You got it. And that's why this whole deal, without any clear guarantees about security, it just feels risky. It makes you wonder, can economic partnerships really work if no one feels safe?
Yeah, it's like trying to build a house on sand. You can have the best house in the world, but without a solid foundation, it's all going to fall apart.
Perfect analogy. And that's why this trip Zelenskyy is taking to the White House, it's crucial. He needs more than just promises, He needs to know the U.S. has his back, for real.
So it's not just about what's on paper. It's about, like, the unspoken stuff, too. The trust between leaders.
Right, diplomacy. It's about building that trust just as much as signing on the dotted line. Zelenskyy needs to figure out how committed President Trump really is, what's really behind those words.
But even if he gets those assurances from the U.S., there's still, well, Europe. We're talking about Macron and Starmer and how worried they are. They seem to want Europe to play a much bigger role in keeping Ukraine safe.
Yeah, they've even talked about sending troops, offering serious support, not just money, but actual, presence. It seems like they think Europe needs to be there, like a deterrent.
So are they saying the U.S. isn't doing enough? That maybe they care more about getting those minerals than they do about Ukraine's safety?
It's a fair question, and it shows that there are, well, a lot of players in this game, each with their own goals. The U.S. wants those minerals, that's pretty clear. Europe wants stability, peace on their doorstep. And then there's Ukraine, caught in the middle, wanting both a good economy and safety.
It's a mess, that's for sure.
Yeah, tangled is a good word for it. It just shows how geopolitics, economics, security, it's all tangled up together. You can't understand one without the others.
So let's imagine some outcomes here. What's the best thing that could happen for Ukraine? And what's the worst case scenario?
Okay, so best case, Zelenskyy gets those rock-solid security guarantees from the U.S. Could be a treaty, could be a really strong, promise. And that lets Ukraine go ahead with the mineral deal, feeling confident that they've got a powerful friend backing them up.
And in that ideal world, that mineral deal gives them the resources they need to rebuild, get their economy strong again. Win-win, right?
Exactly. But then you've got the flip side, the worst case. The U.S. doesn't give those security promises. Ukraine is left exposed. And then other potential partners, like those European countries, might hesitate to get involved too.
Like they don't want to be left holding the bag if things go bad.
Right. And Ukraine ends up, well, relying on a deal that might bring money, but doesn't solve the biggest problem, their safety.
So a lot rides on these talks between Zelenskyy and President Trump. They could change things not just for Ukraine, but for the whole region.
Oh, absolutely. And all of this is happening at a time when U.S. foreign policy is, well, let's say it's changing. President Trump's way of doing things, talking directly to Russia, not going through the usual channels, it's made some European allies nervous.
They're worried about getting left out, right? Like the U.S. might strike a deal with Russia that doesn't help them, or even worse, leaves Ukraine vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a real worry. And it adds another layer to Zelenskyy's visit. He's not just dealing with the U.S., he's trying to make sure Ukraine doesn't get lost in the shuffle if the U.S. and Russia start making their own deals.
So he's walking a tightrope. Needs the money for his country, but can't ignore all these bigger political realities.
That's it. It's high-stakes diplomacy, and he needs to be very, very careful.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this deal doesn't include certain minerals, the ones that are already making money for Ukraine. Why is that detail important?
It shows that this agreement is about future potential, not what they've already got. Ukraine keeps control of what they're already making and uses the untapped resources to bargain for future growth.
So it's strategic, balancing their needs now with what they want down the road.
Exactly. They want to use those minerals, but not risk what they've already built. It's a risk, but one they're willing to take, it seems.
The article also mentions that some of the details, like the size of the U.S. stake in the fund and those security guarantees, well, those are still being worked out. What kind of thorny details do you think might pop up during these talks?
Well, for one, the exact ownership in that fund is still up in the air. They say joint ownership, but how much each side gets, that's not clear yet. The U.S. will probably want as big a piece as possible, which could lead to some tough negotiations.
So even though they've got this agreement, there's still room for each side to try and get the best deal for themselves.
For sure. These agreements are often just a starting point. They set the direction, but the really important stuff, that gets figured out later. And those later talks can be just as important, maybe even more so.
And what about those security guarantees? What do you think Zelenskyy will be asking President Trump for, face-to-face?
I think he'll want a few things. First, a clear promise that the U.S. will defend Ukraine if Russia tries anything. Could be a formal treaty, could be a less formal but equally strong statement of support.
But wouldn't that risk making things worse with Russia? It's a tricky situation, right?
Yeah, it is. Giving too much support to Ukraine might make Russia feel threatened, but not giving enough support leaves Ukraine vulnerable. Classic dilemma, no easy answers.
So what else might Zelenskyy ask for in terms of security, I mean?
More military aid, probably. Yeah. Things like better weapons, special training for their troops. That would make Ukraine stronger, less of a target.
Think the U.S. would go for that?
Maybe, but it depends. What's the political climate in Washington like? How big of a threat is Russia seen as? What are the U.S.'s goals in the region overall?
Sounds like a lot of factors to consider.
A lot of moving parts, yeah. Every move has consequences. Zelenskyy needs to think carefully about his options.
The article quotes a Ukrainian official. They said they agreed to the terms after, and I quote, "Everything unacceptable was taken out of the text, and it is now more clearly spelled out how this agreement will contribute to Ukraine's security and peace." What's your take on that?
That's a pretty telling statement. Seems like the first draft had things Ukraine really didn't like. Shows how tough these negotiations were, how hard Ukraine had to fight for a deal they could live with.
But it also means they got those bad parts removed. They think this final version, even without clear security guarantees, can actually work for them.
Right. They're taking a chance, hoping for the economic benefits and that this deal might, open the door to a safer future.
So a gamble, but one they think is worth it.
Seems that way. They're putting their faith in the future, hoping this agreement will lead to a more stable, more prosperous Ukraine.
And the world's watching, waiting to see if that gamble pays off.
It does. The stakes are high, really high. What happens with this deal could impact way more than just Ukraine. It could reshape the whole region.
Like a real-life geopolitical thriller unfolding right in front of us.
You got it. High stakes, clashing interests, these backroom deals, and an uncertain future. It's all there.
And in the middle of it all, there's Zelenskyy, a leader facing an incredible challenge, trying to guide his country through some really dangerous waters.
He's trying to find a way forward, balance what his people need with all this pressure from global powers. Whether he succeeds or fails, it could change everything for Ukraine and the world.
This mineral deal, this visit to the White House, it's just the start of a story that's going to play out for who knows how long.
Exactly. We're just seeing the first act. And it's an act with, well, global consequences.
This whole thing, it really makes you think about how connected everything is, Like something that starts as a conflict over there, a negotiation over some minerals, can actually have an impact on the whole world.
Yeah, that's the thing about globalization, isn't it? And this deal with Ukraine, if it works out, it could really shake up the market for those minerals, the ones we were talking about.
Lithium, cobalt, graphite, all that stuff that's vital for like electric cars and renewable energy.
Exactly. And Ukraine, with all those untapped reserves, they could become a major supplier, a key player in that market.
So this deal, it could actually kind of push us toward a greener energy future, maybe make those technologies cheaper so more people can afford them.
It's possible, yeah. More supply usually means lower prices, right? Which
Wow.
could make electric vehicles, solar panels, all those things, well, more competitive with the old ways of doing things.
So maybe there's a silver lining here. Something good that comes out of this whole difficult situation in Ukraine.
Maybe so. Even in the middle of all this, all the political tension, the uncertainty, there's always that chance that something positive can come out of it. You never know.
So as we wrap up our look at this complex issue, what are the main things our listeners should keep in mind?
Yeah.
What should they be watching for as this story develops?
I'd say keep your eye on a few things. First, those security arrangements, the ones the U.S. and Ukraine eventually agree on, are they like official guarantees or are they more, informal promises? And how will Russia react to them? How will the rest of the world see them?
And on the economic side of things, what should we be looking out for?
See how the agreement actually plays out, in real life. Does it actually help Ukraine's economy? Is the money from those minerals being used to rebuild the country, to make things better?
So don't just read the headlines. Think about the long-term impact of this deal, not just for Ukraine, but for everyone.
Exactly. It's a story with lots of layers, and we won't see the full effects for a while. But if we try to understand the details, all the different interests at play, the potential consequences, then we can start to see how important this all is.
Yeah, it's a reminder that things that seem like they're happening far away can actually have a big impact on all of us. We're all connected in ways we might not even realize.
That's for sure. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to think about these complicated issues, and to really look at the information we're getting with a critical eye.
Well said. Thanks for helping us make sense of all this. I have a feeling this story's not going away anytime soon.
I don't think so either. This is just the beginning. This whole thing could end up being a really, really important part of global affairs. The stakes are high, there are a lot of players involved, and no one knows for sure how it's going to end. One thing's certain, though. The world will be watching, waiting to see what happens next.